Sometimes life takes everything from you before it gives you something back. Daniel Reyes had lost his wife, his job, and nearly his hope when a lawyer knocked on his door with news that would change everything. His estranged grandfather had left him an old cemetery. Daniel packed up his 10-year-old son Leo and moved to the small caretaker's cottage, hoping for peace. The graveyard was overgrown and forgotten. Most people in town stayed away, saying strange things happened there. Daniel thought it was just talk, until Leo found a hidden door under an old headstone. Behind it was a room filled with stolen treasures worth $20 million. But taking the money meant fighting powerful people who had kept this secret buried for almost a century. What would you do if finding fortune meant risking everything you had left? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Reyes stared at the tattered envelope the lawyer had handed him 3 days ago, the return address still seeming impossible. Millbrook, Connecticut. A place he'd never been, from a grandfather he'd never known existed. Margaret would have known what to make of it all. She always had that way of seeing the deeper currents beneath life's surface, finding meaning in the smallest coincidences. But Margaret was gone now, claimed by cancer 18 months ago, and Daniel was left to navigate these strange waters alone. Well, not entirely alone. Leo sat beside him in the passenger seat of their aging Honda Civic, his dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight as he pressed his face against the window. At 10 years old, Leo possessed his mother's curiosity and her stubborn optimism, qualities that had kept Daniel anchored during the worst months of his grief. "Dad, are we really going to live in a graveyard?" Leo asked, his breath fogging the glass as he spoke. "We're going to live next to a graveyard," Daniel corrected gently. "In a cottage, there's a difference." "But you'll be taking care of dead people," Daniel smiled despite himself. "I'll be taking care of their resting place, making sure it stays peaceful and well-maintained." The truth was more complicated. When the law firm called to inform him about his inheritance, Daniel had been 3 weeks behind on rent and down to his last unemployment check. The plant closing had taken his job as a maintenance supervisor, and the medical bills from Margaret's treatment had consumed their savings. The timing of this unexpected windfall felt almost miraculous or suspicious, depending on how you looked at it. The GPS announced their arrival as they crested a small hill, and Millbrook spread out below them like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. White steepled churches rose above tree-lined streets, where Victorian houses sat behind picket fences and children played in tidy front yards. It was the kind of place Margaret had always dreamed of raising Leo, far from the industrial sprawl of Hartford, where they'd rented their 2-bedroom apartment. "It looks like a movie set," Leo observed, and Daniel had to agree. Everything seemed almost too perfect, as if the town had been preserved in amber sometime around 1950. The cemetery sat on the outskirts of town, marked by a wrought-iron gate that hung slightly askew on rusted hinges. Willowbrook Cemetery, according to the faded sign. The entrance road was more of a dirt path, lined with ancient maple trees, whose roots had buckled the old asphalt in places. Daniel drove slowly, mindful of the car's worn suspension. The caretaker's cottage came into view as they rounded a bend. A small, weathered structure of grey stone and white trim that looked like it had grown from the earth itself. Ivy covered much of the walls, and the front porch sagged slightly under the weight of years and neglect. But the bones of the building were solid. Daniel could see that much, and there was something welcoming about the way afternoon light fell across the front steps. "It's perfect," Leo announced, and Daniel felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. His son's capacity for finding joy in unexpected places never ceased to amaze him. They parked beside the cottage and stepped out into air that smelled of grass and old leaves. The silence was profound after months of urban noise. No traffic, no sirens, just the whisper of wind through branches and the distant sound of church bells marking the hour. Mr. Reyes, a voice called from behind them, and Daniel turned to see an elderly woman approaching from a house visible through the trees. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Eleanor Henderson. I live just over there. I knew your grandfather." Daniel extended his hand. "I'm Daniel, and this is my son Leo. I'm afraid I don't know much about my grandfather. My father never spoke of him." Mrs. Henderson's expression grew thoughtful. Harold was a complicated man, kept to himself mostly, especially in his later years. But he was a good caretaker, took his responsibilities seriously. She glanced at Leo, who was already wandering toward the cottage. "He would have been pleased to know about you both." "What was he like?" Daniel asked. The lawyer had provided only basic facts. Harold Reyes, 78 years old, no immediate family, died of a heart attack in his sleep. The cottage and cemetery property came with a small trust fund for maintenance expenses, barely enough to cover taxes and basic upkeep. Quiet. Thoughtful. He had a way with the grieving families, knew just what to say to comfort them. Mrs. Henderson paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "He carried some burden, I always thought, something from long ago that weighed on him. Maybe that's why he stayed here so long, tending to the dead. Sometimes the past needs careful attention before it can rest." Before Daniel could ask what she meant, Leo's voice rang out from the cottage porch. "Dad, there's a key under the flower pot." Mrs. Henderson smiled. "Harold always said if his family ever came looking, they'd know where to find the key." "Guess he was right." She turned to go, then paused. "If you need anything, groceries, directions, someone to watch the boy, just holler. And Daniel, don't let the town gossip worry you. Most folks around here see Harold's passing as the end of an era. They're curious about what comes next, that's all." Daniel watched her walk away, wondering what kind of gossip she meant. But Leo was calling again, more excited now, and Daniel's questions faded as he climbed the cottage steps. The interior was smaller than it appeared from outside, but surprisingly well-maintained. The living room held comfortable furniture, arranged around a stone fireplace, and evening light streamed through windows that overlooked the cemetery grounds. It felt lived in, rather than abandoned, as if Harold had simply stepped out for a walk and might return at any moment. "Dad, look!" Leo stood beside an antique desk in the corner, pointing to a framed photograph. "Is that Grandpa Harold?" Daniel approached and studied the black-and-white portrait. The man in the photograph was probably in his 40s, with dark hair and serious eyes that reminded Daniel of his own father. He wore a suit and stood beside a woman in a wedding dress, both of them smiling at something beyond the camera's frame. "I think so," Daniel said quietly. His father had mentioned his grandfather only once, during a bitter argument when Daniel was 16. Something about a man who chose strangers over family and lived with dead people because he couldn't face the living. Daniel had always assumed it was just his father's way of explaining why they never had extended family gatherings or holiday visits from grandparents. Leo explored the cottage with the enthusiasm of a born adventurer, reporting his discoveries with breathless excitement. "There's a library with real books and a kitchen with a pie safe." "What's a pie safe, Dad?" "It's where they used to store baked goods to keep them cool," Daniel explained, following Leo from room to room. The cottage held 3 bedrooms upstairs, a master bedroom that must have been Harold's, a smaller room that would be perfect for Leo, and a third space that served as storage. Everything was clean and orderly, as if Harold had been expecting visitors. In the master bedroom, Daniel found Harold's personal effects still in place. Clothes hung in the closet, books lined the nightstand, and on the dresser sat an ornate pocket watch, its silver surface tarnished with age. Daniel picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in his palm. The inscription on the back read, "To Harold, with love and hope for the future. M.E. 1947. "What's that?" Leo appeared at Daniel's elbow, drawn by the gleam of silver. "It was your great-grandfather's," Daniel said, opening the watch case. The mechanism had stopped at 3:17, though whether morning or afternoon was impossible to say. Someone gave it to him a long time ago. Leo studied the watch with the seriousness he reserved for important discoveries. "Do you think he looked at it every day?" "I think he might have." Daniel felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. This man he'd never known had lived a whole life in this place, surrounded by reminders of people he'd cared about and lost. The cottage wasn't just a dwelling, it was a repository of memory, carefully preserved against the passage of time. They spent the evening exploring the immediate grounds around the cottage. The cemetery itself stretched across several acres, divided into sections by age and denomination. Some of the headstones dated back to the 1700s, their inscriptions worn nearly smooth by weather and time. Others were more recent, the granite still sharp-edged and readable in the fading light. Leo showed no fear of the graveyard, treating it like an outdoor museum filled with stories waiting to be discovered. He read names aloud from the stones, making up histories for the people buried beneath. "Sarah Chen, beloved mother, I bet she made the best cookies in town. Private Thomas Manning, died in service to his country. He probably saved everyone in his unit." Daniel found himself relaxing as they walked. There was something peaceful about the ordered rows of graves, the careful maintenance evident in trimmed grass and clean pathways. This was meaningful work, he realized. People brought their grief here and trusted that someone would care for their loved ones' final resting places. Harold had been that someone for decades. And now, the responsibility was Daniel's. As darkness fell, they returned to the cottage and made a simple dinner from supplies they'd brought from Hartford. Leo chattered about school enrollment and whether there would be other kids his age in Millbrook, his enthusiasm infectious. For the first time since Margaret's death, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a future that held more than mere survival. Later, after Leo had fallen asleep in his new bedroom, Daniel sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee and Harold's pocket. Watch. The cemetery stretched out before him in moonlight, peaceful and still. Somewhere out there lay his grandfather, though Daniel hadn't yet located the grave. Tomorrow he would find it and pay his respects to the man who had given them this unexpected sanctuary. The watch ticked steadily in his palm, marking moments that felt precious and finite. Daniel understood now why Harold might have treasured it, not just as a timepiece, but as a reminder that every second mattered, that the present was a gift not to be wasted on regret. He wound the watch carefully and set it running again, its soft rhythm joining the nighttime chorus of crickets and rustling leaves. Somewhere in the darkness, he heard the call of an owl, ancient and knowing, welcoming them home. The storm arrived on their third day in Millbrook, rolling in from the west with the kind of darkness that made afternoon feel like evening. Daniel stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky turn an ominous shade of green, while Leo worked on a jigsaw puzzle at the dining table, a picture of a lighthouse that seemed fitting given their current circumstances. "Looks like we're in for some weather," Daniel said, just as the first fat raindrops began spattering against the glass. Leo glanced up from his puzzle. "Mom used to say storms were just the sky cleaning house." Daniel's chest tightened at the casual mention of Margaret. Leo had been doing that more lately, weaving memories of his mother into everyday conversations, as if she might walk through the door at any moment. Dr. Peterson had said it was normal, healthy even, but it still caught Daniel off guard every time. The rain began in earnest then, drumming against the cottage roof with increasing intensity. Within minutes, it became a downpour that reduced visibility to just a few yards. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by the deep rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the old stone walls. "Dad, the lights are flickering," Leo observed, pointing to the overhead fixture that had begun to strobe irregularly. Daniel made a mental note to check the cottage's electrical system. Harold had maintained the property well, but the wiring was probably decades old. "Might be a good time to find those flashlights Mrs. Henderson mentioned." He'd discovered them the previous day while organizing the kitchen. 3 heavy-duty flashlights in a drawer, along with fresh batteries, and what appeared to be a hand-drawn map of the cottage's layout. Harold had been nothing if not prepared. The tools. Power went out completely, just as Daniel located the flashlights. The cottage plunged into darkness, broken only by the intermittent flash of lightning through the windows. Leo's voice came from the dining room, steady and unafraid. "Found it, Dad, the lighthouse piece." Daniel smiled in the darkness. His son's resilience continued to amaze him. Where another child might have been frightened by the sudden loss of electricity, Leo treated it as another adventure to navigate. They spent the next hour playing cards. By flashlight, the storm raging outside with biblical intensity. Trees groaned under the assault of wind and rain, and several times Daniel heard the crash of falling branches. The cemetery would be a mess tomorrow, he realized. Though cleanup was part of his new responsibilities, it was Leo who first noticed the change in the storm's rhythm. "Dad, listen, it's stopping." Daniel paused in dealing another hand of gin rummy. Leo was right. The drumming of rain on the roof had diminished to a gentle patter, and the lightning had moved off to the east. Within 20 minutes, the storm had passed entirely, leaving behind the kind of crystal-clear air that only comes after a thorough atmospheric cleansing. "Can we go outside and see if there's damage?" Leo asked, already moving toward the front. Lord Daniel hesitated. The cemetery would be muddy and treacherous, full of puddles and fallen debris. But Leo's eagerness was infectious, and Daniel found himself curious about the storm's aftermath as well. They stepped onto the front porch, breathing air so fresh it seemed to sparkle. The world looked newly washed, colors more vivid than they'd been before the storm. Drops of water caught the returning sunlight like tiny prisms, and the scent of rain-soaked earth filled their nostrils with rich, organic perfume. "Look at that," Leo whispered, pointing across the cemetery. A massive oak tree, probably centuries old, had fallen near the cemetery's far boundary. Its root system, exposed by years of erosion and finally undermined by the storm's fury, created a crater the size of a small swimming pool. But what caught Daniel's attention wasn't the fallen giant itself. It was what the tree's collapse had revealed. Several headstones in the tree's vicinity had been shifted by the upheaval, tilted at odd angles or displaced entirely. One in particular, a tall marble monument that had probably stood for over a century, now leaned at a 45-degree angle, its base partially exposed. "We should go look," Leo said, already stepping off the porch. "Careful of the mud, Daniel." You warned, but he was as curious as his son. They made their way across the soggy ground, their shoes squelching in the saturated earth. The tilted monument was more ornate than most in the cemetery, carved with elaborate Victorian flourishes and topped with the figure of a weeping angel. The inscription, though weathered, was still readable. Eleanor Whitmore, beloved daughter and devoted teacher, 1847-1923. She opened young minds to the wonder of learning. But it wasn't the inscription that captured their attention. It was what the storm had exposed beneath the monument's base. The foundation, undermined by decades of shifting soil and water damage, had cracked open to reveal what looked like a set of stone steps leading down into darkness. "Dad," Leo breathed, "there's something under there." Daniel knelt beside the opening, shining his flashlight into the gap. The beam revealed worn stone steps descending into what appeared to be a small chamber, carved from the bedrock itself. The air that rose from the opening smelled old and dry, untouched by the storm above. "It's probably just an old burial vault," Daniel said, though his heart was beating faster. "Some wealthy families built elaborate underground chambers for their deceased." Leo was already trying to squeeze through the opening. "Can we explore it?" Every parental instinct Daniel possessed screamed against the idea. The chamber could be structurally unsound, filled with hazardous gases, or home to any number of dangerous creatures. But another part of him, the part that had loved adventure stories as a boy, whispered that this was exactly the kind of discovery that changed people's lives. "Not without proper equipment," Daniel said finally. "And not alone," they returned. To the cottage to gather supplies, rope, additional flashlights, a first aid kit and a small crowbar Daniel found in Harold's tool shed. Daniel also called Mrs. Henderson to let her know where they were going, though he didn't mention exactly what they'd found. "Be careful around that old tree," she warned. Harold always said that section of the cemetery held secrets better left buried. By late afternoon, they were back at the Eleanor Whitmore Monument, better prepared for exploration. Daniel had rigged a safety line around the base of the tilted stone, and he went first, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The chamber below was larger than it had appeared from above, roughly 12 feet square, with walls, a fitted stone that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. But this was clearly not a burial vault. Instead of a coffin or sarcophagus, the chamber contained something far more intriguing. A collection of wooden crates and metal strongboxes arranged along the walls like inventory in a warehouse. "Dad, what is all this stuff?" Leo asked, his voice echoing in the confined space. Daniel approached the nearest crate, noting that it was sealed but not locked. The wood was old, but well preserved in the dry environment, and stenciled markings on the side read, "Property of Millbrook Historical Museum. Handle with care." With growing excitement and trepidation, Daniel pried open the crate. Inside, nested, in protective cloth, lay objects that took his breath away. A collection of Civil War-era photographs, each one a pristine example of early photographic technique. Beneath them, wrapped in oiled paper, were documents that appeared to be original letters from Union soldiers to their families. Leo had found another crate filled with Native American pottery, each piece wrapped and catalogued with museum-quality care. "Dad, these look really old and important." Daniel moved to one of the metal strongboxes, his hands trembling as he worked the simple latch. Inside were pieces of jewelry that even his untrained eye could identify as valuable. Victorian brooches set with genuine gems, gold watches with intricate engravings, and a collection of coins that appeared to span several centuries. But it was the final item in the strongbox that stopped Daniel's heart entirely. A Victorian mourning locket, elaborate black enamel work surrounding a small crystal window. Through the crystal, he could see a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile that seemed hauntingly familiar. "Dad, you look like you've seen a ghost," Leo observed, and Daniel realized he might have done exactly that. The woman in the locket's photograph bore a striking resemblance to Margaret. The same bone structure, the same expression of quiet intelligence. But that was impossible. This locket was clearly from the late 1800s, more than a century before Margaret's birth. Daniel turned the locket over, looking for any identifying marks. Engraved on the back in delicate script were the words, "M.C. Whitmore, in loving memory." Margaret's maiden name had been Edwards, not Whitmore, but the resemblance was unmistakable, and Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground. "Chamber's cool air." "What did you find?" Leo asked, moving closer to examine the locket. "I'm not sure," Daniel admitted, though pieces of a puzzle were beginning to form in his mind. The museum markings on the crates, the careful preservation of valuable items, the hidden location beneath a grave marker, none of this felt like coincidence. They spent another hour cataloguing the chamber's contents, finding crate after crate of museum-quality artifacts. Historical documents, rare books, artwork and jewelry worth more than Daniel could calculate. Everything bore the same markings. Property of Millbrook Historical Museum. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Leo noticed something Daniel had missed, a leather portfolio tucked behind one of the larger crates. Inside were newspaper clippings from 1924, all relating to a story that made Daniel's blood run cold. Millbrook Museum robbed, priceless historical artifacts stolen. The articles described the greatest crime in the town's history, a sophisticated theft that had emptied the museum's most valuable collections in a single night. The investigation had gone nowhere, the articles reported, with suspicion falling on everyone from traveling criminals to disgruntled employees. The case had eventually gone cold, the stolen artifacts never recovered, until now they climbed out of the chamber as the sun was setting, both of them quiet with the weight of their discovery. Daniel's mind raced with implications. Had Harold known about this cache? Was the storm that revealed it mere coincidence, or something more? Back at the cottage, they spread the newspaper clippings across the dining table and read by lamplight. The theft had occurred on the night of October 15th, 1924, exactly 99 years and 3 months ago. The stolen items matched perfectly with what they'd found in the chamber. "Dad," Leo said quietly, studying one of the newspaper photographs that showed museum staff surveying the empty display cases. "Look at this man in the background." Daniel followed Leo's pointing finger to a figure partially visible in the photograph's margin. A young man in a security guard's uniform, his face turned away from the camera, but his posture suggesting deep distress. The man bore an unmistakable resemblance to the photograph they'd found in Harold's cottage, the young version of Daniel's grandfather. As they sat in the cottage that night, the Victorian mourning locket between them on the table, Daniel felt the weight of history settling around them like dust. They had stumbled upon more than stolen artifacts. They had uncovered a secret that connected their family to this place in ways they were only beginning to understand. Outside, the cemetery lay peaceful under starlight, its secrets temporarily exposed but not yet fully revealed. The storm had been just the beginning. Daniel spent the night pacing Harold's cottage, the Victorian mourning locket clutched in his palm as questions multiplied in his mind. By dawn, he had filled 3 pages of a legal pad with notes, theories, and sketches of what they'd found. The resemblance between the woman in the locket and Margaret couldn't be coincidence. But what did it mean? Leo emerged from his bedroom with the enthusiasm of someone who had slept soundly, despite discovering stolen treasure. "Are we going back to the secret room today?" "First, we're going to do some research," Daniel said, closing his notebook. "We need to understand what we've found before we decide what to do with it." After breakfast, they drove into Millbrook's downtown district, a collection of well-preserved buildings arranged around a central square. The Millbrook Public Library occupied a stately brick building that had probably served the community for over a century, its facade decorated with carved stonework and tall windows that spoke of an era when civic buildings were designed to inspire. Inside, they found Agnes Cole, the head librarian, arranging a display of local history books. She was perhaps 60 years old, with greying hair pulled back in a practical style and intelligent eyes behind reading glasses. Her desk nameplate identified her as having worked at the library for 37 years. "You must be Harold's grandson," she said, extending her hand. "I heard you'd moved into the cottage. I'm Agnes Cole. Your grandfather and I were, well, I suppose you'd call us friends. He came in regularly to research cemetery records and local genealogy." Daniel felt a flutter of hope. "Actually, we're hoping to learn more about the family. History, specifically about this woman." He showed Agnes the photograph from the mourning locket, carefully omitting its source. Agnes studied the image, her expression growing thoughtful. "That's Mary Elizabeth Whitmore. She was a school teacher here in Millbrook around the turn of the century. Died young, in the influenza pandemic of 1923. A tragedy. She was beloved by her students and their families." "Whitmore," Daniel repeated, "like the grave marker in the cemetery. Eleanor Whitmore was her aunt, raised Mary after her parents died. Eleanor donated significantly to the town's cultural institutions, the library, the historical society, the museum." Agnes paused, something shifting in her expression. "Why are you asking about Mary Elizabeth?" Daniel chose his words carefully. "We found some old family items in the cottage. This photograph was among them, and Leo noticed the resemblance to his mother. Agnes looked from the photograph to Leo, then back to Daniel. There's definitely a similarity. Mary Elizabeth was known for her kindness and intelligence. She taught at the elementary school for nearly a decade before the pandemic took her. Leo had wandered off to explore the library's local history section, and Daniel could hear him quietly reading titles aloud. Agnes watched him with a gentle smile before continuing in a lower voice. Your grandfather spent a lot of time researching. The Whitmore family in his final years said he was trying to understand connections that went back generations. He was particularly interested in the period around 1924. Daniel's pulse quickened. Did he say why? Harold was a man who carried secrets, Mr. Reyes. I got the impression he was trying to set something right before he passed. Agnes glanced around the library, then leaned closer. Between you and me, I think he felt guilty about something from long ago. Something he couldn't fix while he was alive. Before Daniel could press for more details, Leo called out from across. The library. Dad, come look at this. Daniel found Leo standing before a glass display case labeled Millbrook History, the early 20th century. Inside were photographs, documents and artifacts from the town's past, including a section devoted to the Millbrook Museum robbery of 1924. Look familiar? Leo whispered, pointing to a display photograph showing some of the stolen items before they disappeared. Daniel's breath caught. Among the museum pieces pictured were several items they'd seen in the hidden chamber, including a distinctive Civil War-era compass and a collection of Native American pottery that were unmistakably the same pieces they'd discovered. Agnes approached, having followed them to the display. Ah, you're looking at our local mystery. The museum robbery was the biggest crime in Millbrook's history. Whoever did it was never caught. What happened to the museum? Daniel asked. It closed permanently after the theft. The loss was too great to recover from. Most of their best pieces were gone, and the insurance settlement wasn't enough to continue operations. The building still stands on Elm Street, though it's been empty for decades. Daniel studied the display more carefully, noting names and dates. The museum director at the time had been Dr. James Morrison, described as a dedicated historian who'd spent 20 years building the collection. The theft had devastated him personally, as well as professionally. Agnes. Daniel said carefully, did Harold ever mention finding anything unusual in the cemetery? Old documents maybe, or he found a museum catalogue from 1924. Agnes interrupted, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. He brought it here several times to cross-reference the entries with newspaper accounts of the theft. He was trying to create a complete inventory of what was stolen. Daniel felt pieces clicking into place. Do you still have that catalogue? Agnes glanced around again, then moved to her desk and unlocked a drawer. From it, she withdrew a leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed with age. He asked me to keep this safe, said someday it might be important. The catalogue was meticulously detailed, listing hundreds of items with descriptions, provenance, and estimated values. As Daniel flipped through the pages, he recognized item after item from the hidden chamber. Every major piece they'd found was listed here, along with photographs and detailed documentation. This is remarkable, Daniel breathed. It's a complete record of everything that was stolen. Harold thought so too. He spent months going through it, making notes in the margins. Agnes pointed to Harold's handwriting scattered throughout the catalogue. See here. He was tracking which items had been recovered over the years, antiques that showed up at estate sales, pieces that appeared in private collections. But most of the collection remained missing. Leo had been listening intently to their conversation. Now he tugged on Daniel's sleeve. Dad, should we tell her what we found? Daniel looked at Agnes, weighing his options. She had clearly cared about Harold and was already aware of his interest in the theft. If anyone could help them navigate this situation, it might be her. Agnes, what would you do if someone discovered some of the stolen museum pieces today? Her eyes sharpened. Hypothetically, I'd contact the authorities immediately. Historical artifacts belong to the community, not to individuals. But she paused, studying Daniel's face. I'd also be very careful about how I approach the situation. There are people in this town whose families have been here for generations. People with long memories and strong opinions about how the past should stay buried. What kind of people? The kind who profit from things staying as they are. Millbrook has changed a lot since 1924, Mr. Reyes, but some of the old power structures remain intact. The same families still control the bank, the town council, most of the local businesses. Agnes closed the catalogue and returned it to her desk drawer. If valuable historical artifacts suddenly surfaced, there would be questions about where they've been all this time. Questions that might make certain people uncomfortable. Daniel felt a chill of apprehension. Are you saying we'd be in danger? I'm saying your grandfather was a cautious man who lived alone for good reason. And I'm saying that if you found something important, you need to think very carefully about your next steps. They left the library with more questions than answers, but also with a growing understanding of what they were facing. In the car, Leo buckled his seatbelt and turned to Daniel with the seriousness that sometimes made him seem older than his years. Dad, we're going to do the right thing, aren't we? Even if it's dangerous? Daniel started the engine thinking about Margaret and the values she'd tried to instill in their son. Honesty, integrity, standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. She would have known exactly what to do in this situation. Yes, he said finally, we're going to do the right thing, but we're going to be smart about it. That afternoon, they returned to the hidden chamber with the museum catalogue, systematically checking each item against Harold's notes. The match was perfect. Every significant piece from the theft was accounted for, preserved in climate-controlled conditions that had kept them in museum-quality condition for nearly a century. As they worked, Daniel found himself thinking about Harold's final years. Had his grandfather known about this cache? Had he been the one to hide it, or had he simply discovered it as they had? The newspaper clipping suggested Harold might have witnessed the original theft, but that raised more questions than it answered. By evening, they had documented everything, creating their own inventory, complete with photographs taken on Daniel's phone. It was an impressive collection. Artwork, historical documents, Native American artifacts, Civil War memorabilia, and jewelry that would be worth millions in today's market. But as Daniel locked the cottage door that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Agnes's warnings echoed in his mind, and he found himself checking the windows more than once before settling into Harold's favorite chair with the museum catalogue. The weight of the discovery was beginning to settle on his shoulders. They had found something extraordinary, but they had also inherited a secret that had already cost one man his peace of mind. Now it was their burden to bear, and Daniel was beginning to understand why Harold had lived alone with his ghosts for so many years. The banker's ledger changed everything. Daniel discovered it on their 5th day in Millbrook, hidden in a false bottom drawer of Harold's desk while searching for spare batteries. The leather-bound book fell open in his hands, revealing pages of meticulous handwriting in faded blue ink, dates, amounts, and names that made his blood run cold. "Leo, come look at this," Daniel called, though he wasn't sure his son should see what he'd found. Leo bounded down from his bedroom, where he'd been organizing his collection of interesting cemetery stones. "What is it?" "Your great-grandfather kept detailed financial records," Daniel said carefully, flipping through pages that documented transactions spanning from 1923 to 1925. Very detailed records. The ledger told a story of corruption that reached into every level of Millbrook's government. Monthly payments to Mayor William Blackwood, Sheriff Edmund Brady, Judge Harrison Foster, and Bank President Charles Morrison. The amounts were substantial, more money than these men should have been able to account for on their government salaries. But it was the notation system that made Daniel's hands tremble. Each payment was coded with letters that, when cross-referenced with the museum catalogue, clearly indicated specific stolen items. CBW Mayor, 500 pottery collection. EDB Sheriff, 750 Civil War documents. HJF Judge, 1200 Victorian jewelry set. Dad, what do these numbers mean? Leo asked, studying the ledger over Daniel's shoulder. I think they mean your great-grandfather was keeping track of bribes, Daniel said quietly. People who were paid to look the other way when the museum was robbed. Leo's eyes widened. So Grandpa Harold knew who stole everything? Daniel turned to the final entries in the ledger, dated December 1924. The handwriting here was more erratic, as if written under stress, cannot continue. The guilt is too heavy. M.E. deserves better than this silence. God forgive me for what I've done. Below that, in a different pen and steadier hand, were the words, hidden until justice can be served. H.R. Christmas Eve, 1924. Leo, Daniel said slowly, I think your great-grandfather might have been involved in the robbery, but I also think he regretted it and tried to make it right. They spent the morning cross-referencing the ledger with the museum catalogue and the items in the hidden chamber. Every piece matched Harold's coding system. He had documented not just what was stolen, but who had been paid to ensure the crime went unsolved. The implications were staggering. The most prominent families in Millbrook, names that still appeared on street signs and business facades, had been built on the foundation of a century-old cover-up. Daniel photographed every page of the ledger with his phone, then locked it in Harold's desk drawer. They needed to be strategic about how they revealed this information. Agnes had been right about the danger. If the descendants of these families still held power in Millbrook, they would not welcome evidence of their ancestors' crimes. There. Research was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the cemetery driveway. Through the front window, Daniel watched a black sedan park near the cottage. Two men emerged, one in an expensive suit, the other with the bearing of private security. Stay inside, Daniel told Leo, stepping onto the front porch as the men approached. The man in the suit was probably in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that spoke of inherited authority. He extended his hand with a politician's practiced smile. Mr. Reyes, I'm Richard Blackwood, Mayor of Millbrook. This is my associate, Mr. Thompson. We wanted to welcome you to our community. Daniel shook hands warily, noting that Thompson remained several steps behind, his attention focused on scanning the property. Thank you, we're settling in well. I knew your grandfather, Blackwood continued. Good man, Harold. Kept to himself, but always maintained the cemetery beautifully. We were sorry to lose him. Did you know him well? Well enough. My great-grandfather was mayor when Harold first took the caretaker position. It's been a Blackwood family tradition to check on the cemetery from time to time, make sure everything's running smoothly. Blackwood's smile remained fixed, but his eyes were calculating. Speaking of which, I noticed some storm damage from the other night. That old oak tree came down pretty hard. We're planning to have it removed, Daniel said carefully. I hope. You found the cleanup manageable. Sometimes storms can expose, well, old drainage issues, foundation problems, that sort of thing. Nothing that can't be handled with the right approach. Daniel felt the subtle menace beneath Blackwood's friendly tone. We haven't encountered any serious problems. Good, good. Of course, if you do discover anything unusual, old pipes, structural damage, anything that might require municipal assistance, you'll let us know immediately, won't you? Of course. Blackwood turned to go, then paused as if remembering something. Oh, and Mr. Reyes. Harold was known for collecting old documents, local history materials. If you come across anything like that while settling his affairs, the town would be very interested in preserving those records for our historical society. We wouldn't want important community documents to accidentally end up with people who might not understand their significance. After the men left, Daniel found Leo peering through the kitchen curtains. Who were they, Dad? Politicians, Daniel said, which was both accurate and inadequate. Leo, we need to be very careful about who we talk to about what we found. Some secrets are dangerous. That afternoon, Daniel called Agnes Cole from Harold's landline, asking her to research the Blackwood family history. Her callback came within an hour. "Daniel, you need to be careful," she said without preamble. Richard Blackwood's great-grandfather was Mayor William Blackwood, the same William Blackwood who was supposedly investigating the museum robbery in 1924. His family has controlled Millbrook politics for 5 generations. What about the other names from the ledger? Sheriff Edmund Brady's descendant is the current Sheriff Tom Brady, his great-nephew. Judge Harrison Foster's grandson sits on the town council. The Morrison family still owns the largest bank in town. Agnes paused. "Daniel, these aren't just old family names. These are the people who run Millbrook today." Daniel felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Harold hadn't just discovered evidence of a crime. He had uncovered a conspiracy that had shaped the town's power structure for a century. No wonder he had lived in isolation, carrying the burden of knowledge too dangerous to share. "Agnes, what would happen if this information became public? It would destroy some very powerful families. It would also raise questions about how much they knew about their ancestors' crimes." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Daniel, it might also put you and Leo in serious danger." That evening, Daniel found Leo sitting on his bedroom floor, surrounded by photographs he'd printed from their phone. The boy had arranged them into categories: artifacts, documents, and ledger pages. "Dad, look at this," Leo said, pointing to one of the ledger photographs. "See this entry from December 20th, 1924. It says, M.E. asking questions, becoming dangerous." Who was M.E.? Daniel felt his stomach drop. "Mary Elizabeth Whitmore, the woman from the mourning locket." Leo nodded solemnly. "And she died in 1923, right? From the flu pandemic?" "That's what Agnes told us." "Dad," Leo said quietly, "what if she didn't die from the flu? What if she found out about the robbery and someone—" "Leo, that's enough." Daniel's voice was sharper than he intended. The same thought had been nagging at him all day, but hearing it from his 10-year-old son made it somehow more real and more terrifying. They ate dinner in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Daniel found himself checking the locks twice and pulling the curtains closed against the gathering darkness. Every car that passed on the distant road seemed to slow down as it approached the cemetery entrance. Later, after Leo had gone to bed, Daniel sat at Harold's desk with the ledger open before him. The last entries painted a picture of a man tortured by guilt and fear. Harold had been young in 1924, probably barely 20, and had somehow become involved in something far beyond his understanding. Daniel traced his finger along Harold's final notation: hidden until justice can be served. His grandfather had spent the rest of his life guarding these secrets, waiting for someone who could safely reveal the truth. The responsibility felt crushing. Daniel had come to Millbrook hoping for a quiet place to heal and rebuild. Instead, he had inherited a legacy of corruption and violence that reached into the present day. The powerful families that Harold had documented were still in power, still controlling the levers of authority in Millbrook. But he had also inherited something else. The evidence needed to expose the truth. The question was whether he had the courage to use it and whether he could keep Leo safe while doing so. Outside, the cemetery lay peaceful under starlight, its residents keeping their eternal silence. But Daniel knew now that some of those graves held secrets darker than death, and that the living could be far more dangerous than any ghost. The hand-drawn map changed Daniel's understanding of Harold's final years entirely. Leo discovered it tucked inside an old Bible on Harold's nightstand, a detailed diagram of Willowbrook Cemetery showing locations marked with tiny X's and numbered notations that corresponded to entries in a separate notebook. "Dad, there are at least 6 more hiding spots," Leo announced, spreading the map across the kitchen table. "Look, Grandpa Harold marked them all." Daniel studied the careful cartography. Harold had documented every section of the cemetery, noting elevation changes, drainage patterns, and what appeared to be underground anomalies. 3 locations were marked as verified, while others carried notations like possible or investigate further. He spent years mapping this place, Daniel murmured, tracing Harold's precise pencil lines. This wasn't just cemetery maintenance. This was archaeology. The nearest marked location was behind the old mausoleum that housed the Whitmore family crypt. According to Harold's notes, he had detected an anomaly there in 1987, but had never pursued the investigation. The notation read, "Subsurface irregularity, stone echo suggest void, requires careful excavation." Despite every instinct screaming caution, Daniel found himself agreeing to Leo's request to investigate. They waited until afternoon, when the cemetery's few regular visitors had departed, then made their way to the Whitmore Mausoleum with shovels and Harold's metal detector. The mausoleum was the impressive structure of grey granite, built in the 1890s when the Whitmore family had been among Millbrook's most prominent citizens. Eleanor Whitmore's name was etched above the entrance, along with those of her parents and siblings. But it was Mary Elizabeth's inscription that drew Daniel's attention. "Beloved niece and teacher, taken too soon by cruel fate." "Dad, the metal detector is going crazy over here," Leo called from behind the mausoleum. Daniel found his son standing over a patch of ground that looked no different from the surrounding area, but the detector's steady beeping confirmed Harold's decades-old observation. Careful probing with a long metal rod revealed a hollow space, approximately 3 feet below the surface. The excavation took most of the afternoon. Unlike their storm-revealed discovery, this cache required genuine archaeological work. Careful removal of soil, documentation of their progress, preservation of the site's integrity. Leo proved to be an excellent assistant, displaying patience and attention to detail that reminded Daniel painfully of Margaret's methodical approach to complex problems. What they uncovered was smaller than the first cache, but potentially more significant. A metal strongbox wrapped in oiled canvas and sealed with wax. Inside, they found documents that made Daniel's hands shake as he read them. The centerpiece was a collection of handwritten letters, all dated between October and December 1924, all signed with the initials MEW. Mary Elizabeth Whitmore had been conducting her own investigation into the museum robbery, and her letters documented a growing understanding of the conspiracy. "My dear friend Sarah," one letter began, "I fear my suspicions about the museum incident have been proven correct. The theft was not the work of outside criminals, as the authorities claim, but rather an inside operation involving several prominent citizens of our community." Another letter, dated November 15th, was more specific. "I have observed Mayor Blackwood meeting privately with known criminal associates. Sheriff Brady has been asking suspicious questions about museum security procedures. Most disturbing of all, young Harold Reyes appears to be involved, though I believe against his will. The boy seems terrified." Daniel's throat tightened as he read Harold's name. The final letter in the collection was dated December 20th, 1924, just 3 days before Mary Elizabeth's reported death from influenza. "Sarah, I fear I have learned too much. My inquiries have been noticed, and I have received warnings to cease my investigation. If something should happen to me, please know that I have hidden evidence where it will eventually be found by those brave enough to seek justice. The truth must survive, even if I do not." Leo read silently over Daniel's shoulder, his young face grave with understanding. "Dad, she knew she was in danger." "It appears so." Daniel examined the other documents in the strongbox, receipts showing unusual cash transactions, a partial list of stolen items that matched Harold's ledger, and most damning of all, a photograph showing Mayor Blackwood shaking hands with a man identified on the back as Jimmy the Knife Torino, Chicago. The photograph was dated October 10th, 1924, 5 days before the museum robbery. They were so absorbed in the documents that neither noticed the figure approaching until Sheriff Tom Brady spoke from directly behind them. "Afternoon, folks. Mind, if I ask what you're doing here?" Daniel's heart hammered as he turned to face the lawman. Brady was probably in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades dealing with human nature at its worst. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor professional, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. "Just some cemetery maintenance," Daniel said, hoping his voice sounded steadier than it felt. Tree roots were affecting the drainage around the mausoleum. Brady glanced at the excavation site, the metal detector, the documents that Daniel was desperately trying to shield from view. "Looks like pretty extensive maintenance work. Find anything interesting?" "Just some old drainage pipes," Leo said quickly. "Really rusty ones." The sheriff's attention fixed on Leo with an intensity that made Daniel's protective instincts flare. "Smart boy. Bet he's good at finding things that are supposed to stay buried. We should probably get cleaned up for dinner," Daniel said, beginning to gather their tools. "Long day of work." "I'm sure it was." Brady made no move to leave. "You know, your grandfather and I had an understanding about this cemetery. Harold knew that some things were better left undisturbed. Old pipes, old drainage systems, that sort of infrastructure can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing." The threat beneath Brady's words was unmistakable. Daniel felt Leo move closer to him, instinctively seeking protection. "Will, be careful," Daniel said. "See that you are. Millbrook's a peaceful community, Mr. Reyes. We'd hate for anything to upset that peace." Brady tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Enjoy your evening." They watched him drive away before speaking again. Leo's voice was small when he finally broke the silence. "Dad, I'm scared." Daniel pulled his son close, feeling the boy's trembling. "Me too, Leo, but we're going to figure this out." That evening, they spread Mary Elizabeth's letters across Harold's dining table, cross-referencing them with the banker's ledger and the museum catalogue. The story they told was clear. Mary Elizabeth Whitmore had uncovered the truth about the robbery and had been murdered to silence her. The official cause of death, influenza, provided perfect cover. The 1923 pandemic had claimed thousands of lives across New England, and one more victim would raise no suspicions. But Mary Elizabeth's letters proved she had been healthy and investigating when she supposedly succumbed to illness. "Dad," Leo said quietly, studying the final letter, "do you think Grandpa Harold felt guilty because he couldn't save her?" Daniel considered the question, thinking about the young man Harold had been, barely 20, caught up in events beyond his control, watching helplessly as a good woman died for seeking justice. "I think he spent the rest of his life trying to make up for what happened," Daniel said finally. "Maybe that's why he preserved all this evidence. He was waiting for the right time, the right person to finally tell the truth. And he chose us. It seems like he did." Leo was quiet for a long moment, then looked up at Daniel with eyes that seemed far older than his 10 years. "What are we going to do?" Before Daniel could answer, the cottage phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown local number, and Daniel hesitated before answering. "Mr. Reyes?" The voice was elderly, female, and frightened. "This is Mrs. Henderson. I'm calling from my sister's house in the next town. I saw Sheriff Brady leaving your property earlier, and I thought you should know. He came by my house asking questions about what you've been doing in the cemetery." Daniel's blood chilled. What kind of questions? "He wanted to know if you'd been digging, if you'd found anything unusual. He also asked about your relationship with Agnes Cole." Mrs. Henderson paused, and Daniel could hear the fear in her voice. "Mr. Reyes, I think you and Leo might be in danger. These people, they've been protecting their secrets for a long time. They won't hesitate to protect them now." After Mrs. Henderson hung up, Daniel double-checked all the locks and pulled the curtains tight. Leo helped him carry Harold's evidence upstairs to the master bedroom, where they could secure it in Harold's old wardrobe. As they prepared for what might be a sleepless night, Leo touched Daniel's arm. "Dad, What if we're the last chance to get justice for Mary Elizabeth? Daniel looked at his son, this brave, thoughtful boy who had already lost his mother and was now facing dangers no child should have to confront. Margaret would have been proud of Leo's courage, but she also would have insisted on protecting him at all costs. Then we'll make sure justice is served, Daniel said, though he had no idea how they would accomplish such a thing against opponents who controlled every level of local authority. Outside, Willowbrook Cemetery lay shrouded in darkness, its secrets multiplying with each passing hour. Somewhere among those graves lay Mary Elizabeth Whitmore, a woman who had died seeking truth. Daniel was beginning to understand that her fight was far from over. The museum director's personal journal arrived via an unexpected source. Agnes Cole appeared at the cottage door early the next morning, clutching a worn leather portfolio and looking nervously over her shoulder. "I couldn't sleep after our conversation yesterday," she said, hurrying inside. "I kept thinking about Harold and what he was trying to accomplish. Then I remembered something." She opened the portfolio to reveal a collection of handwritten pages, photographs and official documents. This belonged to Dr. James Morrison, the museum director who lost his collection in 1924. His daughter brought it to the library years ago, asking us to preserve it for historical purposes. But after reading it, I realized it was too dangerous to keep in public archives. Daniel accepted the portfolio with trembling hands. "What's in it?" "Evidence." Dr. Morrison spent the last 40 years of his life documenting what really happened. To his museum, he never gave up trying to recover the stolen items. Leo crowded close as Daniel opened the journal to the first entry, dated January 15, 1925. "I can no longer pretend the robbery was the work of outside criminals. The evidence is overwhelming. This was an inside operation, planned and executed by people I trusted, people this community trusted. My attempts to pursue the truth have been met with threats, intimidation, and official obstruction at every level." The journal chronicled Dr. Morrison's growing frustration with the investigations. Deliberate sabotage. Sheriff Brady's great-grandfather had refused to follow obvious leads. The mayor had discouraged public discussion of the case, and the judge had dismissed Morrison's attempts to pursue civil litigation against suspected conspirators. Most damaging were Morrison's detailed observations of the town's power structure in the months following the robbery. Several prominent families had suddenly acquired unexplained wealth, new homes, expensive automobiles, lavish parties that seemed inconsistent with their known sources of income. "Agnes," Daniel said, looking up from the journal, "did Dr. Morrison ever go public with these accusations?" He tried. In 1926, he submitted a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office, complete with documentation and witness statements. The complaint disappeared. A week later, Morrison's house was burglarized, his research was stolen, and he received a visit from men who made it clear that his health would suffer if he continued his investigation. Leo had been studying the photographs tucked into the journal's pages. "Dad, look at this one." The photograph showed a group of men in suits standing outside what appeared to be a warehouse. The handwritten caption read, "Distribution Meeting, November 1924. Items being prepared for transport out of state." Daniel recognized several faces from other photographs they'd found. Mayor Blackwood, Sheriff Brady, and in the background, looking young and terrified, Harold Reyes. "This is proof that Harold was there," Daniel murmured. "But look at his body language. He doesn't look like a willing participant." Agnes nodded. Dr. Morrison believed Harold was coerced into participating. The boy had no family, no resources to resist pressure from powerful men. Morrison actually tried to help him escape Millbrook in 1925, but Harold refused to leave. Why would he stay? Guilt and fear that abandoning his post would make things worse for other innocent people. Agnes turned to a later entry in the journal. Morrison wrote that Harold had become obsessed with Mary Elizabeth Whitmore's death. The boy was convinced she'd been murdered, and he felt responsible for not protecting her. Daniel felt a wave of sympathy for his grandfather. Harold had been barely older than Leo when he'd been caught up in events beyond his control, forced to choose between self-preservation and moral courage. He'd chosen a middle path, staying in Millbrook to guard the evidence, waiting for someone who could safely expose the truth. Their discussion was interrupted by the sound of a car approaching. Agnes peered through the front window and paled. It's Richard Blackwood, with several other men. Daniel quickly gathered the journal and other documents, shoving them into Harold's desk drawer. "Leo, go upstairs and stay in your room until I call for you." "But Dad, now Leo, please." Blackwood's knock was polite but insistent. Daniel opened the door to find the mayor accompanied by 3 other men. Tom Brady, a man in an expensive suit whom Daniel didn't recognize, and Thompson, Blackwood's security associate. "Mr. Reyes," Blackwood said with his practiced political smile, "I hope we're not interrupting. We'd like to have a conversation about your plans for the cemetery." "My plans are to maintain it properly," Daniel replied, not inviting them inside. "Of course, but we've heard you've been doing some rather extensive excavation work. Archaeological investigations, one might say." Blackwood's smile never wavered. "The town has certain regulations about historical preservation. We wouldn't want any important artifacts to be damaged or lost." The threat was clear, but Daniel held his ground. "I'm following proper procedures for cemetery maintenance." Sheriff Brady stepped forward. "Mr. Reyes, we've received reports of suspicious activity on your property. Late-night digging, unauthorized visitors." His eyes fixed on Agnes, who had remained visible through the front window. "People who might be encouraging you to pursue activities beyond your expertise." "Mrs. Cole was helping me research cemetery records," Daniel said. "I'm sure she was." The unknown man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of serious money. "I'm Charles Morrison, president of Millbrook First National Bank. My great-grandfather built this community's financial foundation, and I have a vested interest in protecting its stability." Daniel's heart sank as he realized the implications. The Morrison family, descended from Dr. James Morrison, but apparently controlled by the same forces that had silenced him decades earlier. "Mr. Reyes," Morrison continued, "sometimes people inherit more than they can handle. Properties with complications, responsibilities that require specialized knowledge. The town would be willing to purchase the cemetery property from you at a generous price, relieving you of these burdens." "The cemetery isn't for sale." Blackwood's smile finally faded. "Mr. Reyes, let me be direct. Your grandfather understood certain boundaries that exist in this community, boundaries that have maintained peace and prosperity for generations. I hope you'll prove as wise as Harold was." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm offering advice. Millbrook can be a wonderful place to raise a family, safe, quiet, with excellent schools and community support. But it can also be challenging for people who don't understand local customs." After the men left, Agnes emerged from the kitchen where she'd been listening. "Daniel, you need to get that evidence to someone outside Millbrook. These people control everything here. The police, the courts, the banks. Local justice isn't possible. Who can we trust?" "I have contacts at the State Historical Society. People who would be very interested in recovered artifacts and historical crimes." Agnes gathered her coat, preparing to leave. "But you need to be careful how you proceed. These families have protected their secret for a century. They won't hesitate to eliminate threats." That afternoon, while Leo worked on homework at the kitchen table, Daniel called the State Historical Society from Harold's landline. The conversation was encouraging. Dr. Patricia Vance, the Society's Director of Historical Crimes, was indeed interested in recovered artifacts and had resources for protecting evidence and witnesses. "Mr. Reyes," Dr. Vance said, "what you're describing sounds like the Millbrook Museum case. We've had that file open for decades, hoping new evidence would surface. Can you bring the materials to our offices in Hartford? Would that be safe? Safer than keeping them in Millbrook?" We work closely with the FBI's art crime team when dealing with stolen historical artifacts. If you found what you think you found, federal jurisdiction applies. Daniel arranged to meet Dr. Vance the following day, but as he hung up the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that their calls were being monitored. In a town where the same families had controlled power for generations, privacy was probably an illusion. That evening, Leo helped Daniel organize copies of all their evidence, using Harold's old photocopier to create backup sets of documents and photographs. They worked by lamplight, speaking in whispers, both understanding that their time in Millbrook was running short. "Dad," Leo said as they sealed the copies in waterproof containers, "what if we can't prove what happened to Mary Elizabeth?" Daniel paused in his work, thinking about the woman whose death had haunted his grandfather for 70 years. "Then at least we'll have tried. Sometimes that's all we can do, bear witness to the truth, even when we can't deliver justice." Leo nodded solemnly, and Daniel was struck again by his son's maturity. This experience was changing them both, forcing them to confront questions of courage and conscience that most people never faced. Outside, Willowbrook Cemetery lay peaceful under starlight, its residents keeping their eternal secrets. But Daniel knew that some secrets demanded to be told, regardless of the consequences. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of speaking for the dead. The false wall in the cottage basement changed everything Daniel thought he knew about Harold's story. Leo discovered it by accident while chasing a dropped pencil that had rolled behind Harold's old workbench. The boy's sharp eyes noticed that the basement wall didn't quite align properly, a subtle difference in stone color and mortar texture that suggested newer construction hiding something older. "Dad, this wall is weird," Leo called from his hands, and knees behind the workbench. "It sounds hollow when I tap it." Daniel joined his son, running his hands along the questionable section of wall. Leo was right. The stonework here was different, and careful examination revealed the outline of what had once been a doorway, later bricked up and disguised to match the surrounding foundation. It took them most of the morning to carefully remove enough stones to create an opening large enough to squeeze through. Behind the false wall lay a small chamber that Harold had clearly used as his most secret hiding place. Unlike the treasure caches in the cemetery, this space was personal, a repository of Harold's innermost thoughts and most dangerous secrets. The key centerpiece was a metal filing cabinet that had been meticulously maintained despite the basement's dampness. Inside, Daniel found Harold's most precious possessions: birth certificates, employment records, personal correspondence, and a leather-bound diary that spanned nearly 60 years. "Leo," Daniel breathed as he opened the first document, "I think we just found the truth about everything." Harold's birth certificate told a story Daniel had never imagined. Born Harold Emmanuel Reyes on March 15, 1904. To parents listed as Manuel Reyes, night watchman, and Elena Reyes, domestic worker. The employment section included a devastating entry: father employed, Millbrook Historical Museum, night security, 1920-1924. "Dad, what does this mean?" Leo asked, studying the documents over Daniel's shoulder. "It means Harold's father worked at the museum. He was there when it was robbed." Daniel's hands trembled as he reached for Harold's personal diary, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. The diary's early entries revealed a young man trapped by circumstances beyond his control. Harold's father, Manuel, had discovered the robbery plan through overheard conversations and suspicious activity at the museum. When he tried to report his concerns to the authorities, he learned that the police, mayor, and judge were all involved in the conspiracy. "October 10th, 1924, Daniel read aloud. "Papa came home tonight, more frightened than I have ever seen him. He says the robbery will happen within days, and that Sheriff Brady warned him to stay silent or face deportation. Papa has no legal status in this country. We could be separated forever if he speaks against these men." Leo pointed to another entry. Look at this one, Dad. October 16th, 1924. It is over. The museum was robbed last night, just as Papa predicted. But something went wrong. Papa was supposed to be elsewhere when it happened, but the thieves changed their plan. They needed someone inside to disable the alarm system, and they forced Papa to help them. Now he is part of their crime, and we are trapped by their secret. Daniel felt sick as the truth became clear. Harold's father had been coerced into participating in the robbery, used as the inside man because of his vulnerable immigration status and intimate knowledge of the museum's security systems. The young Harold had watched his father's anguish, understanding that Manuel was both victim and accomplice. The diary entries from the weeks following the robbery documented the family's isolation and fear. Manuel had been consumed by guilt, knowing that his forced participation had enabled the crime. Harold had dropped out of school to support his father, taking odd jobs and eventually accepting the position as cemetery caretaker. A job that kept him close to the evidence while providing the family with housing and stability. November 30th, 1924. Daniel continued reading. Miss Whitmore came to see Papa today. She knows something about the robbery and wants his help to expose the truth. Papa is terrified. He says these men will kill us both if we cooperate with her. Investigation. But Miss Whitmore is kind and persistent. She reminds Papa that good people have lost their heritage because of this crime. Leo had found another section of the hidden chamber, this one containing Harold's father's personal effects. Among them was a museum security guard's uniform, a set of keys that probably opened display cases, and most importantly, a detailed floor plan of the museum marked with handwritten notes about the robbery's execution. "Dad, this shows exactly how they did it," Leo said, studying the floor plan. Harold's grandpa marked the route the thieves took, which alarms they disabled, even where they parked their truck. But it was Harold's final discovery that left Daniel speechless. Hidden in a special compartment within the filing cabinet was a small wooden box containing items that Manuel Reyes had taken from the museum, not as part of the robbery, but as evidence to prove his forced participation if the authorities ever chose to investigate honestly. Inside the box were photographs of the actual thieves in action, clearly showing faces and documenting the crime as it occurred. Manuel had managed to use the museum's camera equipment to create a photographic record of the conspiracy, despite the danger to himself and his son. The photographs were devastating in their clarity. Mayor Blackwood directing the placement of stolen items into wooden crates, Sheriff Brady standing guard while thieves worked, Judge Foster examining valuable artifacts as if appraising their worth. And in several images, Manuel Reyes himself, his face showing the terror of a man forced to betray his principles. But the most important photograph showed something Daniel hadn't expected. Mary Elizabeth Whitmore, standing in the museum's doorway. During the robbery, her face illuminated by flashlight as she witnessed the crime in progress. "Leo," Daniel whispered. She saw everything. Mary Elizabeth didn't just investigate the robbery after it happened. She was there when it occurred. Harold's diary explained what the photograph couldn't capture. Mary Elizabeth had come to the museum that night to retrieve some materials she needed for her classes, arriving at exactly the wrong moment. The thieves had been forced to detain her to prevent her from raising an alarm, and they had threatened to kill both her and the Reyes family if she revealed what she had witnessed. December 15th, 1924. Daniel read from the diary's final entries. "Miss Whitmore cannot stay silent any longer. The guilt is destroying her, just as it is destroying Papa. She has told me she plans to write letters documenting everything she knows, hiding copies where they will eventually be found. She believes the truth must survive, even if we do not." The diary's last entry was dated December 23rd, 1924. "Miss Whitmore is dead. They say it was influenza, but I know better. Papa is beside himself with grief and terror. We are next if we do not disappear completely. Papa has decided to hide all the evidence and pray that someday someone braver than us will find it and do what we could not. Daniel sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had discovered. Harold hadn't been a peripheral figure in the museum robbery. He had been the son of the primary witness, inheriting not just evidence, but the crushing responsibility of keeping the truth alive. "Dad," Leo said quietly, "Harold spent his whole life protecting these secrets so that someday we could tell the truth. It looks that way." Daniel examined the photographs again, noting details that would be crucial for any modern investigation. "Leo, these pictures are evidence of multiple federal crimes: theft, conspiracy, possibly murder. This isn't just historical artifact recovery anymore. They spent the rest of the day cataloging Harold's hidden archive, creating a complete inventory of evidence that spanned from the original robbery through decades of cover-up. The materials painted a picture of institutional corruption that had shaped Millbrook's development for nearly a century. As evening approached, Daniel made two important phone calls. The first was to Dr. Patricia Vance at the State Historical Society, informing her that their meeting would need to include federal law enforcement. The second was to a Hartford hotel, booking rooms under false names for the following night. "Are we running away?" Leo asked, as Daniel packed their most essential belongings. "We're being strategic," Daniel corrected. "Harold waited 70 years for the right moment to reveal this truth. We need to make sure we don't waste his patience by being careless now." That night, as they prepared to leave Willowbrook Cemetery, for what might be the final time, Daniel found Harold's father's museum keys on his keychain, a gesture of respect for the man who had sacrificed everything to preserve the evidence they now carried. Outside, the cemetery lay peaceful under starlight, its residents keeping secrets that would soon be revealed to the world. Harold's long vigil was finally ending, and justice for Mary Elizabeth Whitmore was about to begin. The heist plan document that Daniel discovered hidden behind Harold's father's photograph proved that the museum robbery had been orchestrated by Millbrook's founding families as a deliberate act of historical theft. Unlike the random crime it had been portrayed as, the 1924 robbery was actually the culmination of a conspiracy involving four of the town's most powerful dynasties: the Blackwoods, Bradys, Fosters, and Morrisons. "Dad, look at this," Leo said, pointing to a hand-drawn diagram that showed the museum's layout with military precision. They planned everything months in advance. The document, written in Mayor Blackwood's distinctive handwriting, outlined not just the robbery itself, but also the long-term strategy for disposing of stolen artifacts and maintaining the cover-up. Most chilling was the final section, titled Containment Protocols, which detailed how to handle problematic witnesses and uncooperative participants. Daniel photographed every page with his phone, while Leo kept watch at the cottage windows. They had decided to leave Millbrook that morning, but Daniel wanted to document everything before abandoning Harold's sanctuary. "The really scary part," Daniel said, studying the containment protocols, "is how systematic they were about eliminating threats. They had contingency plans for dealing with anyone who might expose them." Mary Elizabeth Whitmore's name appeared throughout the documents, initially as MEW, Teacher Low Risk, but later upgraded to MEW, Immediate Threat, Permanent Solution Required. The clinical language couldn't disguise what it meant. They had planned her murder from the moment she began asking questions. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Patricia Vance at the State Historical Society. "FBI Art Crime Team wants to meet today. Can you come to Hartford immediately?" As Daniel typed his response, Leo called urgently from the front window. "Dad, there are cars coming up the driveway, lots of them." Daniel joined Leo at the window and felt his blood chill. 5 vehicles were approaching the cottage, including Sheriff Brady's patrol car, Blackwood's sedan, and 3 other cars carrying men Daniel didn't recognize. This wasn't a social visit, "Upstairs now," Daniel ordered, grabbing the most crucial documents and evidence. "Pack only what we absolutely need." They moved quickly but quietly, gathering their essential belongings and the most damning evidence. Daniel's heart pounded as he heard car doors slamming and voices conferring outside. Through Leo's bedroom window, he could see men positioning themselves around the cottage's perimeter. "Mr. Reyes," Blackwood's voice called from the front porch, accompanied by insistent knocking. "We need to have a conversation. Please open the door." Daniel and Leo crept down the back stairs, hoping to reach the rear door before the cottage was completely surrounded. But as they reached the kitchen, Daniel saw Thompson, Blackwood's security man, standing guard outside the back door. They were trapped. "I know you're inside, Mr. Reyes," Blackwood continued. "We've been monitoring your phone calls. We know you've been in contact with state authorities about historical materials you believe you found on this property." Daniel's mind raced. If they knew about the phone calls, they probably knew about the meeting with Dr. Vance. The cottage's landline could easily have been tapped, and cell tower records would show his communications with Hartford. "Dad, the basement," Leo whispered. "We can get out through the old coal chute." It was a desperate plan, but their only option. They descended to the basement, gathering the most crucial evidence they could carry. The coal chute hadn't been used in decades, but it still provided access to the outside, though anyone emerging from it would be visible from several angles. As they prepared to make their escape, Daniel heard footsteps above and the sound of the front door being forced open. Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the old house. "Search everything, find whatever they've been hiding, and make sure they haven't removed anything from the property." Daniel stuffed the heist plan document and Harold's father's photographs into his jacket, then helped Leo climb into the coal chute. The boy disappeared into the darkness above, and Daniel followed, praying they wouldn't be seen emerging on the far side of the cottage. They crawled through 50 feet of narrow tunnel, emerging behind a cluster of overgrown shrubs near the cemetery's boundary. From their hiding spot, they could see men searching the cottage and grounds with professional thoroughness. "We need to get to the car," Daniel whispered. But even as he said it, he saw Thompson examining their Honda Civic, probably disabling it to prevent their escape. Leo tugged on Daniel's sleeve and pointed toward the cemetery's back gate, a rusty iron entrance that probably hadn't been used in decades. Beyond it lay a dirt road that connected to the county highway system. They'd moved carefully through the cemetery, using headstones and monuments for cover. Daniel felt a strange sense of protection from the silent residents of Willowbrook, as if Harold and Mary Elizabeth and all the others were helping to conceal their escape. The back gate's lock had long since rusted away, and they slipped through into freedom, just as they heard shouts from the cottage area. Someone had discovered the coal chute exit. The dirt road led to a small cluster of houses about a mile from the cemetery. Daniel knocked on the first door they reached, hoping to find someone willing to help strangers in obvious distress. An elderly woman answered, took one look at their faces, and immediately invited them inside. "You're Harold's family," she said without waiting for introductions. "I'm Martha Kellerman. Harold helped my husband through his final illness. We've been waiting for someone to carry on his work." Daniel quickly explained their situation, showing Martha some of the documents they'd escaped with. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she understood the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. "Those families have run this town for generations," she said, "but they've never had to deal with federal authorities before. You need to get this evidence to people who can't be bought or intimidated." Martha drove them to a neighboring town where they caught a bus to Hartford. During the 2-hour journey, Daniel used Leo's tablet to upload digital copies of their evidence to secure cloud storage, creating backups that couldn't be destroyed or confiscated. Dr. Patricia Vance met them at the Hartford bus station, accompanied by FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the Art Crime Team. Agent Torres took one look at the documents Daniel had brought and immediately called for additional federal resources. "Mr. Reyes," Agent Torres said as they settled into a conference room at the FBI field office, "what you've uncovered appears to be one of the most significant cases of organized historical theft in New England history. These documents provide evidence of federal crimes that are still prosecutable despite their age. Leo sat quietly beside Daniel as Agent Torres explained the scope of the federal investigation that would now begin. The stolen artifacts represented millions of dollars in cultural heritage theft, but the conspiracy itself, involving public corruption, murder, and decades of cover-up, constituted racketeering charges that could destroy the power structure. Blackwood's allies had built. What about our safety? Daniel asked. These people have demonstrated they're willing to use violence to protect their secrets. Federal witness protection is available if necessary, Agent Torres replied. But our experience suggests that once these conspiracies are exposed to federal scrutiny, the participants typically focus on legal defense rather than additional crimes. That evening, from the safety of a Hartford hotel room, Daniel called Agnes Cole to warn her about the day's events. Her phone went directly to voicemail, and when he tried the library, a recording announced it was closed due to unexpected circumstances. "Dad, what if they hurt Mrs. Cole because she helped us?" Leo asked, voicing Daniel's worst fears. "Then we make sure their crimes are exposed completely," Daniel replied. "The best way to protect everyone is to ensure the truth comes out." Late that night, as Leo slept in the hotel bed beside him, Daniel reviewed Harold's father's photographs. One more time, the images captured not just a crime in progress, but the faces of men who had believed themselves above justice. Their descendants had inherited that arrogance, but they were about to learn that some secrets couldn't be buried forever. Tomorrow, federal agents would begin executing search warrants across Millbrook, armed with evidence that Daniel and Leo had preserved despite enormous danger. Harold's long vigil was finally ending, and justice for Mary Elizabeth Whitmore was about to begin. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous phase of their journey was still ahead. Desperate people would take desperate measures to protect themselves, and the revelation of century-old crimes might trigger contemporary violence. He held Leo closer and tried to find peace in sleep, knowing that morning would bring either vindication or catastrophe. The museum director's final letter arrived at the FBI field office via overnight courier from Sarah Martinez, Dr. James Morrison's daughter. Agent Torres called Daniel and Leo to the conference room early the next morning, her expression grim as she displayed the yellowed pages under protective plastic. Ms. Martinez says her father wrote this letter in 1967, just before his death, Agent Torres explained. She's kept it sealed for nearly 60 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal its contents. Daniel leaned forward as Agent Torres began reading the letter aloud. Dr. Morrison's final words provided the smoking gun that would make the federal case ironclad. To whoever finds this letter, I can no longer remain silent about the crimes committed against the people of Millbrook and the cultural heritage of our nation. The robbery of our museum in 1924 was orchestrated by Mayor William Blackwood, Sheriff Edmund Brady, Judge Harrison Foster, and my own cousin, Bank President Charles Morrison. They used their positions of public trust to steal artifacts worth millions of dollars, murdering Mary Elizabeth Whitmore when she threatened to expose them. Leo's eyes widened as Agent Torres continued reading the most damning section. I have documentation proving that Charles Morrison laundered the proceeds through his bank, that Judge Foster dismissed legal challenges to protect the conspiracy, and that Sheriff Brady personally murdered Mary Elizabeth Whitmore by injecting her with a fatal dose of morphine, then bribing the coroner to falsify her death certificate as influenza. Daniel felt sick as the clinical details of Mary Elizabeth's murder were revealed. She hadn't died from pandemic illness. She had been assassinated by the same law enforcement officer sworn to protect her. The letter includes specific bank account numbers, burial locations of additional evidence, and names of witnesses who were threatened into silence, Agent Torres said. Dr. Morrison spent 40 years documenting every aspect of the conspiracy, waiting for federal authorities who couldn't be corrupted. Within hours, the FBI had assembled a task force of 20 agents to execute simultaneous raids across Millbrook. Daniel and Leo watched from the field office as live updates came in via radio and secure phone lines. Teams Alpha and Beta have secured the Blackwood residence and business offices, Agent Torres reported. Initial search has uncovered financial records going back to the 1920s, including ledgers that appear to match your grandfather's documentation. The raids revealed decades of careful record-keeping by the conspirators' families. Rather than destroying evidence of their ancestors' crimes, each generation had preserved the documentation, partly from arrogance, partly from fear that destroying records might trigger investigations they couldn't control. Sheriff Brady's family had maintained detailed files on security concerns dating back to 1924, including surveillance reports on Harold Reyes and other potential witnesses. The files documented a systematic campaign of intimidation that had kept Millbrook's secrets buried for generations. But the most significant discovery came from Charles Morrison's bank vault, where federal agents found Dr. Morrison's original research files, the materials that had supposedly been stolen during the 1926 burglary of his home. They kept everything, Agent Torres said, studying the recovered documents. Bank records, witness statements, even photographs of the stolen artifacts in their private collections. They documented their own crimes in meticulous detail. Leo had been unusually quiet during the morning's revelations. Now he spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of everything. Agent Torres, what happens to all the stolen museum pieces? Do they go back to the community? That's exactly what happens, Agent Torres replied with a smile. The artifacts will be recovered and returned to public ownership. Millbrook will finally get its cultural heritage back. The afternoon brought more dramatic developments. Richard Blackwood had been arrested at his office, caught attempting to destroy financial records that linked his family's wealth to the original conspiracy. Tom Brady had barricaded himself in the sheriff's department, demanding immunity in exchange for cooperation. But the day's most important breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Agnes Cole called the FBI field office from a safe house in the next county. "I've been hiding since yesterday," she told Daniel over speakerphone, "but I have something that might be the final piece of your puzzle. Dr. Morrison gave me a package years ago with instructions to open it only if federal authorities began investigating the museum case." Agnes had spent the morning examining the package's contents, original negatives of photographs Harold's father had taken during the robbery, along with audio recordings Dr. Morrison had made of conversations with witnesses in the 1960s. The recordings include testimony from the coroner, who falsified Mary Elizabeth's death certificate, Agnes reported. He was dying of cancer in 1965 and wanted to confess before meeting his maker. Dr. Morrison captured everything on tape. By evening, the federal case had expanded beyond historical theft to include ongoing racketeering charges. The evidence showed that Millbrook's power structure had been built on criminal proceeds, with each generation using public positions to protect and expand their ill-gotten wealth. Daniel and Leo returned to their hotel room exhausted but hopeful. For the first time since discovering the hidden cache, Daniel felt that justice might actually be possible. The federal investigation had momentum, evidence, and resources that couldn't be intimidated or corrupted. "Dad," Leo said as they prepared for bed, "do you think Grandpa Harold would be proud of what we did?" Daniel considered the question, thinking about the young man who had spent 70 years carrying an impossible burden. "I think he'd be proud of your courage, Leo, and I think he'd be grateful that the truth is finally coming out." Outside their hotel window, Hartford's lights twinkled in the darkness, but Daniel's thoughts were with Millbrook and the people who had suffered in silence for so long. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation between truth and power, between justice and corruption. The fight Harold had begun as a terrified 20-year-old was finally approaching its conclusion. and Daniel was determined to see it through. To the end, Harold's final video message changed Daniel's understanding of everything they had endured. Agent Torres called them back to the FBI field office the next morning with news that federal investigators had discovered a sophisticated safe hidden behind a false wall in the cottage basement, a safe that Daniel and Leo had missed during their desperate escape. The safe was voice-activated, Agent Torres explained, leading them to a secure viewing room. It opened when one of our technicians said your son's name. Your grandfather programmed it to respond specifically to family members. The safe had contained a single item, a digital video recorder with a message labeled, "For Daniel and Leo Reyes, the truth about our family." Daniel's hands trembled as Agent Torres started the playback. Harold appeared on screen, looking older and more frail than in the cottage photographs, but his eyes were clear and determined. "My dear grandson and great-grandson," Harold's recorded voice began, "if you are watching this, it means you have found the evidence I spent 70 years protecting, and you have been brave enough to bring it to the authorities." Leo reached for Daniel's hand as Harold continued his final testimony. "I was 20 years old when they forced my father to help rob the museum. Papa was terrified of deportation. We had no legal status, no protection from men who controlled every aspect of law enforcement in Millbrook. When they threatened to separate our family forever, Papa agreed to disable the museum's alarm system." Harold's voice grew heavy with emotion as he described the night that changed everything. Mary Elizabeth Whitmore was not supposed to be there. She came to retrieve teaching materials and walked into the middle of the robbery. The thieves panicked. They couldn't let her go, but they couldn't hide her presence indefinitely. Sheriff Brady made the decision to eliminate her. Daniel closed his eyes, knowing what came next. They held her for 3 days while they finished disposing of the stolen artifacts. Brady told everyone she was sick with influenza, keeping visitors away from her apartment. On December 23rd, he injected her with morphine stolen from Dr. Henderson's medical bag. She died, believing that good people would eventually expose the truth. Harold paused, wiping tears from his eyes before continuing. "Papa and I were witnesses to her murder, but we were also accomplices to the robbery. Brady made sure we understood that exposing his crimes would mean confessing our own participation. We were trapped by our guilt and our fear." The video revealed Harold's decades-long strategy for preserving evidence while protecting his family from retaliation. "I spent my life guarding these secrets, waiting for federal authorities who couldn't be corrupted by local power. I chose to remain in Millbrook, maintaining the cemetery where Mary Elizabeth was buried because someone needed to keep the truth alive until justice became possible." Leo squeezed Daniel's hand as Harold addressed them directly. "Daniel, I know you lost your beloved Margaret just as I lost the woman I might have married if I had been braver in 1924. Mary Elizabeth and I had begun to care for each other. She was teaching me to read properly, helping me imagine a future beyond my father's shame." Daniel felt tears on his cheeks as he understood the full weight of Harold's sacrifice. His grandfather had spent 70 years alone, carrying not just guilt about the robbery, but grief for a love that had been murdered before it could bloom. "Leo, my brave boy," Harold continued, "you have your great-great-grandfather's courage and your mother's kind heart. The evidence you found was always meant for your family. People who would understand that some things matter more than personal safety." Harold's final words provided the guidance they needed for the trials ahead. The artifacts belong to the community. The truth belongs to history. Justice belongs to Mary Elizabeth and all the other victims of these crimes. Do not let the guilty escape because they are powerful. Do not let the innocent suffer because they are vulnerable. As the video ended, Agent Torres provided an update on the federal investigation's progress. "The grand jury will begin hearing evidence next week. Based on what we've recovered, we expect indictments for racketeering, conspiracy, historical, theft and murder." "Murder?" Daniel asked. "Can you prosecute a century-old murder?" Federal law has no statute of limitations for murder committed in connection with racketeering activity. Sheriff Brady's killing of Mary Elizabeth Whitmore was part of an ongoing criminal enterprise that makes it prosecutable today. Leo had been quietly absorbing Harold's final message. Now, he looked up at Agent Torres with the seriousness that sometimes made him seem older than his years. What happens to the people in Millbrook who weren't part of the crimes? The regular families who just lived their lives? Agent Torres smiled at the question. They get their town back, Leo. Once the corruption is exposed and prosecuted, Millbrook can become the community it was supposed to be, governed by law instead of criminal conspiracy. That afternoon brought news that the investigation had reached its climax. Federal agents had arrested Charles Morrison, Richard Blackwood, and Tom Brady on charges ranging from racketeering to obstruction of justice. Each man faced decades in federal prison if convicted. But the day's most significant development came when Brady, faced with overwhelming evidence, agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony provided details about the conspiracy that even Harold's documentation hadn't captured. Brady admits that his great-grandfather murdered Mary Elizabeth Whitmore, Agent Torres reported. He also confirms that the stolen artifacts were sold through a network of corrupt dealers in Boston and New York, with proceeds laundered through Morrison's bank. Daniel felt a profound sense of vindication as the truth finally emerged. Harold's 70 years of patient guardianship were being validated by federal prosecutors who couldn't be intimidated or bought. That evening, as they prepared for the journey back to Millbrook, Leo asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. "Dad, what happens to us now? Do we stay in Millbrook or do we go somewhere else?" Daniel considered the question carefully. They had come to Millbrook seeking peace and a fresh start. Instead, they had found danger, corruption, and a legacy of injustice that had consumed months of their lives. But they had also found purpose, courage, and connection to family history that neither had known existed. Harold's cottage and Willowbrook Cemetery represented more than just an inheritance. They were a responsibility that had been passed down through generations. "I think," Daniel said finally, "that depends on whether Millbrook feels like home. After all this is over." Outside their hotel window, Connecticut's landscape rolled past in gathering darkness. Tomorrow, they would return to the cemetery where their journey had begun, not as fugitives or investigators, but as witnesses to justice finally served. Harold's long vigil was ending, and Mary Elizabeth Whitmore would finally have the truth she had died seeking. Harold's letter to Daniel waited on the cottage kitchen table, placed there by FBI agents who had completed their final search of the property. The envelope bore Daniel's name in Harold's careful handwriting, along with a note, to be opened only after justice is served. 6 months had passed since the federal investigation began. Richard Blackwood, Tom Brady, and Charles Morrison had all been convicted on racketeering charges and sentenced to lengthy federal prison terms. The stolen artifacts had been recovered and were being prepared for public display in a new Millbrook museum, funded by the forfeiture of assets seized from the criminal conspiracy. Daniel opened Harold's final letter with hands that no longer trembled, his fear replaced by a deep sense of peace. Leo sat beside him at the kitchen table, both of them ready to hear Harold's last words to his family. "My dear Daniel and Leo," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means the truth has finally been revealed and justice has been served. I pray that the burden I carried for so many years has not damaged your lives as it damaged mine." Harold's words revealed the depth of regret that had shaped his solitary existence. "I have spent 70 years wondering if I could have saved Mary Elizabeth Whitmore if I had been braver, if I had spoken truth regardless of the consequences. I have lived with the knowledge that good people suffered because I chose silence over courage, but the letter's central message was about forgiveness and new beginnings. I hope you will understand that my silence was not cowardice, but strategy. I was waiting for family members who could succeed where I failed. People with the courage to risk everything for justice and the wisdom to know when that risk was worth taking. Harold had made specific provisions for their future. The cottage and cemetery are yours by right, but also by choice. If you decide to stay in Millbrook, know that you are welcome in a community that is finally free from the corruption that poisoned it for generations. If you choose to leave, know that you have given me the greatest gift possible, the chance to finally rest in peace. The letter concluded with Harold's blessing. Daniel, you have the strength your father always possessed, but never recognized in himself. Leo, you have inherited the best qualities of all the generations that came before you. Together, you have accomplished what I could never do alone. You have brought light into darkness and justice into injustice. Leo wiped tears from his eyes as Daniel finished reading. Dad, I think we should stay. Daniel looked around the cottage that had become their home during months of danger and discovery. The rooms that had once held secrets now felt peaceful, filled with afternoon sunlight and the promise of ordinary days ahead. Why do you want to stay? Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Because Grandpa Harold spent his whole life taking care of this place, waiting for us, and because Mary Elizabeth is buried here, and someone should remember her properly. That afternoon they walked through Willowbrook Cemetery, noting the changes that had occurred since federal intervention. The grounds were better maintained now, funded by restitution payments from the convicted families. Several new headstones had been erected for people whose graves had been unmarked for decades, including a beautiful granite memorial for Mary Elizabeth Whitmore that read, "Beloved teacher and seeker of truth. Her courage lives forever. Agnes." Cole joined them at Mary Elizabeth's grave, carrying flowers from her garden and news from the town. "The new mayor is planning a memorial service for all the victims of the conspiracy," she reported. "Dr. Morrison will be honored alongside Mary Elizabeth and the other people who suffered for seeking justice." Daniel felt a profound sense of completion as they stood among the graves of people who had been silenced for nearly a century. Their voices had finally been heard, their stories finally told. "Agnes," Daniel said, "Harold left instructions about donating his research files to the library. He wanted them available for anyone studying this period of Millbrook's history. That would be wonderful. The Historical Society is already planning exhibits about the museum robbery and recovery. Your family's courage will be part of the permanent record." That evening, Leo helped Daniel arrange Harold's belongings in the cottage, deciding what to keep and what to donate. They found photographs of Harold and Mary Elizabeth together, confirming that their relationship had been more than Daniel had realized. In one image, they sat on the cottage porch, Harold teaching Mary Elizabeth to use his father's camera while she helped him with reading lessons. They looked happy, Leo observed, studying the photographs. They were building something together, Daniel agreed, before it was taken away from them. As autumn approached, Daniel enrolled Leo in Millbrook Elementary School, the same school where Mary Elizabeth had taught nearly a century earlier. The building had been renovated with restitution funds, and Leo's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, made sure her students understood the history of courage and justice that had shaped their community. Leo thrived in his new environment, making friends easily, and displaying the same curiosity about local history that had led to their great discovery. He started a school project documenting the stories of cemetery residents, helping preserve memories that might otherwise have been lost. Daniel found meaningful work as the official caretaker of Willowbrook Cemetery, a position that came with respect rather than isolation. The cemetery had become a pilgrimage site for people interested in historical justice, and Daniel took pride in maintaining it as a place of peace and reflection. On the anniversary of their arrival in Millbrook, Daniel and Leo held a private ceremony at Harold's grave. They had finally located the modest headstone in the cemetery's oldest section, marked simply Harold Emmanuel Reyes, 1904-2024, Faithful Guardian. "Grandpa Harold," Leo said, placing fresh flowers on the grave. "We kept our promise. The truth came out and the bad guys went to prison." Daniel added his own flowers and stood quietly for a moment, thinking about the man who had sacrificed a normal life to preserve justice for future generations. "Thank you," he said simply, "for waiting, for believing we would do the right thing, for showing us that some things are worth any sacrifice." As they walked back to the cottage in gathering twilight, Daniel felt the profound peace that comes from completing a sacred task. Harold's vigil was over, Mary Elizabeth's truth had been revealed, and justice had finally been served. The cemetery lay peaceful under starlight, its residents resting in the knowledge that their stories would not be forgotten. Daniel and Leo had inherited more than property. They had inherited a legacy of courage that would guide them for the rest of their lives. In the cottage that night, as Leo worked on homework and Daniel read beside the fireplace, both felt the deep satisfaction of being exactly where they belonged. They had found their place in the world, not through seeking comfort or safety, but through choosing justice over fear. Outside, Willowbrook Cemetery kept its eternal watch, no longer guarding secrets, but preserving truth for future generations, who would need reminders that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort and justice over silence.